Hey everyone. Today, Sarah Zahavi and I discuss The Humanities Have Sown the Seeds of Their Own Destruction, an article by Tyler Austin Harper from The Atlantic in December 2023. You can find it linked in the show notes, and I hope you enjoy the conversation.
My mother said something really interesting to me when I was in grade 12, and that takes us into the article in some sense. I had picked out my university program by grade 10, and then grade 12 came around, and I was kind of, wishy-washy on it. And I said, what if I just went to college instead, right? It was like a 2-hour period of my life where I said, well, what if I started looking into colleges and found something else to do? My mother turned to me and she said, you're going to go to university, you're going to get a 4-year degree, you're going to come out of it with a bachelor's, and I don't care if you don't use it for the rest of your life, but you will have a bachelor's degree.
Like when you hear that as a kid, like what's from your mom? Like what's your reaction to that?
I understood it. I understood it really strongly because we had the same story happens with my grandfather and my father. My grandparents brought their family over to Canada. My grandfather was an electrician. He was a master electrician. He was one in Russia and in Ukraine actually, but it was the Soviet Union.
What year did your grandparents come?
My grandparents on my father's side made Aliyah in 1973, right? So they were there for the Yom Kippur War, and then they came to Canada eventually. My mother came in the early 80s.
Directly from Soviet Union?
Yeah. Spent like 6 months in Italy and then made her
All Ukraine, both parents?
No, my dad's from Odessa and my mother's from St. Petersburg.
Okay.
So they came in. And my grandfather was a master electrician, and my father would go and work with him. And my father, I think at some point expressed this desire because he knew the ropes. So he said, maybe I'll be an electrician. And my grandfather said, I didn't come here from Russia for you to become an electrician. You're going to go, you're going to get a degree, and you're going to move up. I think I'm still stuck in this world of first generation Canadian where university is the ultimate achievement. And I think everyone else around me has moved on from that, but I haven't because I'm still stuck in it.
So I grew up, my dad is a professor. So university was like the be all. I mean, academics was the be all and end all. Like I remember growing up, like for my dad, who was sort of the primary, like I would say he set the academic tone or school tone in our family. Like for my dad, even though my mom's a super intellectual, he thought, doctors were like glorified technicians and lawyers were all like shysters, right? Like for him, academia was like the holiest and purest thing a person could do with a brain, right? Like my brother, who became super religious, dropped out of college to sit and learn Torah all day, and none of his kids are going to university, and it kills my dad. It kills him in so many ways. What's funny is no matter how many times I'll try to talk to my dad about they can earn a living just fine. There is so much, capitalist infrastructure within the Haredi world, in the yeshiva world. They're not doing that now. They're all learning in Kollel because that's what they want to do. But if they had the inclination to go out and make money, they're not actually really lacking opportunities because they don't have a bachelor's. So but my dad sees that as that's impossible. They're definitely going to lack opportunities.
It's interesting because I completely understand and even ascribe to your father's mindset where I don't think this is a capitalist issue, right? I think it's an issue of education, especially within modern Orthodox circles. When you value getting an education and you value getting a secular education in particular, then the fact that they can go out into the world and make money is secondary to the fact that they haven't received an education.
So can we talk about that for a second? What is the value of an education?
I was thinking about this when I sent you the article. There are groups of people that just
wait. Let's do this first. Let's summarize the article.
Sure.
Okay, because we're gonna put some context. Okay, so I'm gonna summarize. I want you to jump in here, right? Because the article is actually, I think, structured a little bit in a kind of clunky way. So I'm gonna try and get this right. But jump in if you think I'm missing anything or I didn't get anything right. Okay. So the sort of the start of the article is a suggestion that if you want to look at sort of the move within the humanities in university toward woke progressive mindsets, right? That it's typically framed when people are criticizing it, it's typically framed as an ideological war, right? That there is like a war of progressives against sort of the traditional forces. They've taken over universities with their agenda and so on. And he thinks this is maybe an unhelpful framing. That it's probably more realistic to frame this in terms of the economic incentives that exist within the university structure that inevitably led to this sort of woke progressive push. So he doesn't deny that it's there. It's definitely there, but it's not really about like a sudden ideological agenda as much as the way the financial incentives are set up. This was kind of an inevitable direction. Does that sound right?
Yeah.
Okay. So he starts with this. He says, radicalization is more of an unintended consequence of diversity hiring, right? So you have quotas that administrators are essentially placing on departments where there has to be a certain number of minority professors. And so where are you going to find minority professors? Well, you're going to find those professors in sort of more progressive, fields like gender studies, study of decolonization or whatever you might put that. I'm butchering this, but some, fill in the blank. And then that's going to cycle down to, well, PhD candidates looking for academic careers are going to say, well, what fields within the humanities, because this is all within the humanities, and we'll get to the sciences in a second, but what fields can I choose to go into that have the best chance of getting me on a tenure track? Well, universities are hiring in these sort of, progressive areas. I'm going to go into those areas. And so you've created this cycle that continually feeds into that. And so that begs the question, well, why are the financial incentives set up the way they are? And here he says, and I think he overlooks something here, but we'll at least put it on what he says. So first he says, well, the students are the paying customers, right? And this is something that I think, for many years, education kind of didn't want to admit to itself, but, has become much more overtly spoken about, certainly in private high schools, this is the case, that the student and their families are the customers of the institution. And the value proposition for students in, let's say the last several decades has become, one of two options. Number one is make me money, right? So I'm coming to university so I can get a career that's going to make money. And the second value proposition that students are looking for is to make me feel good about myself. And because students are coming into university with a more and more progressive mindset, they're either choosing a field that's going to make them money, or they're choosing a field that's going to make them feel good. And the feel-good field is going to be a progressive field.
I would disagree on that front, whereas I don't think that they're going into it to make them feel good. It's more of, at least from how I understood the article, the administration perceives this customer model of student, and they know which of their faculties are going to successfully engage the customer model of students. So anything within finance, business, STEM, all of those is equivalent
going to engage that I want to make money student.
Right, exactly, because it justifies itself, right? You give them, if you're in America, $150,000, you come out of it with a Harvard business degree, you can go make money now. The humanities don't work that way. So now the humanities need to justify their existence for this financial structure of why should you give $120,000? The John Mulaney joke? I paid $120,000 for someone to tell me to go read Jane Austen, and then I didn't. Right. So now they have to justify their existence. So they have also turned themselves woke because now they say, we exist because we're going to enact social justice.
I see. So it's not so much that the students are coming in expecting that. It's that that message, it's sort of like they market tested that message, and that message resonated with students, right? He has a great line. I'm going to find this here. If the arc of the universe bends toward justice, some would have you believe that it is the humanities departments that do the bending.
Exactly.
So
Right?
that's a message that like I can sell that to students. That's a sellable message.
Yes,
Very
and
good.
it's a sellable message to any kind of person who's going to give any sort of financial investment. If you have a president like of the country that strongly believes in the progressive bent of politics, then Harvard's saying, "Oh, we are exploring how to better integrate women into the workforce through our, gender studies department," then you can justify getting grants.
Is it fair to say this? In the author's view, it's not like, certainly universities didn't come with an agenda. And in fact, he has this great line, I'll quote this. "A cynic could easily argue that the core purpose of the humanities has become to provide the illusion of progressivism to deeply unprogressive institutions, helping them appeal to wealthy liberal students. Colleges usher in social justice warrior faculty through the front door while exploiting workers, piling up student debt, and wooing mega-rich donors in the back. Humanities professors often think we're critics of academic capitalism and rarely pause to wonder if we're its unwitting stooges."
Exactly.
Right. So the universities themselves actually don't have this agenda. There isn't like some move in the universities to do this. It's much more there's a zeitgeist going on, right? And the university, like any good capitalist institution that's trying to sell itself, it's trying to tap into the zeitgeist. And as the zeitgeist has become more liberal, progressive, friendly for all sorts of reasons that have nothing necessarily to do with the universities, universities just tapped into that and shaped their humanities department to sell that zeitgeist.
Exactly. And I think that's the main thing, that the administrators of university are really just looking to make money. I had this history professor for one of my liberal arts courses that I took, and I have a friend who stayed close to that, and we went out for coffee a couple of years ago. And she started telling me about how Ryerson University tried to open up a branch in either Dubai or Egypt because they were trying to get their hands on oil money.
Right.
Right. So you would think that
NYU was like all over. NYU was like it's like all over the Middle East because it was just an easy way to make money.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's the thing, because you would think that something like Ryerson or TMU, which is such a progressive institution, would think twice about trying to get their hands on dirty capitalist oil money. And not at all, because it's all about the Benjamins.
Right. Okay, great. Let's talk about the value of an education. And it's interesting because the article focuses on the humanities education, and it kind of assumes that a STEM education is like in this like money-making genre. Like kids are going to choose a STEM education because that's a money-making field. I'm not sure that that's true. Certainly not in the US model where, you're getting a general education first, a general undergraduate liberal arts education. But let's stay within the humanities for our purposes. What's the purpose of an education?
Within the humanities sphere, what I would say is cultivating curiosity, developing communication skills, and that's written and verbal communication skills, and developing critical thinking. The ability to look at a source and extract its meaning and then critique it. And when it works successfully, the person that it produces is capable of getting to any role they want. I know someone, bachelor's degree in philosophy, ended up in some sort of in healthcare insurance, working as the liaison between the R&D team and the sales team, because you need someone there that's going to enact the communication between both sides. So as long as you have the skills and the ability to talk the talk, you can put yourself into anywhere.
So it's interesting. You mentioned philosophy majors. Like there were, when I was in finance, there were some like cool hedge fund, private equity funds out there that like would specifically look for like English and philosophy majors, right? Because that like, from their perspective, they figured, I could train you on financial analysis, but I want your brain to work in a different way than someone who's just been doing that for their entire education. I agree with what you're saying, right? And like certainly that's been the focus of how I teach as a teacher, which is very skills focused, which I'm sure we'll talk about. But I guess my question is, and this is the question that kind of haunts me, is a traditional humanities education the best way to gain, you said, curiosity, communication, and critical thinking? Like, is that the best way to do that?
I think the current model for humanities education is not. I don't know if this is still the case, but when I was in Ulpanat, a really large percentage of the speeches that were performed in class before the annual speech competition were decrying the school's sciences culture, and they were saying, oh, we really need to value the humanities more. And I think it's still the same case nowadays that no one values the humanities within the school. They think bio and chemistry is their ticket to a good future. And the humanities courses are somewhat of a joke.
That's where the US system is a little better, where like kids in high school are not thinking about selecting paths so early. So schools are much more humanities focused. And like I would say like the difference between the best student at Ramaz, where I taught in New York, and the best student at Bnei Akiva Schools, it's not an IQ difference. There's no, there's no basic fundamental difference. It's the student in Bnei Akiva Schools is far ahead of the Ramaz graduate in math and science because that's what the system endorses. Whereas the Ramaz graduate is a more well-spoken, well-rounded, articulate, or good writer, I would say, than the average Bnei Akiva School student. And that's because they focus on English and history much more. In the end, it probably all evens out, but that's my observation.
Well, within the universities, now that they've gone woke, so to say, and I don't like the adjective, but it works. I don't know if the humanities education will be able to even it out. Because like my experience taking humanities courses in university was you wrote what the professor was looking for you to write.
Right.
And it was generally
Well, that gets me back to
thing.
Okay, so that gets me back so let's go with what you're saying. You're saying is humanities is a good way of gaining these skills. The way it's structured right now is not. Well, what would be a better way? And then I still come back to my question, is that the best way? Right? Like I'll tell you why I say this, because like I wonder about like just people you see with these skills, right? With curiosity, with good communication skills, with good critical thinking skills. Like how many of them got those skills from a good humanities education versus those who are just like, they're sort of like I grew up in a very intellectual home. Like we talked about, the op-ed page of the New York Times at our Shabbos table, right? Like we talked about issues and current events. So of course, an academic environment appeals to me, and seeing things through a humanities lens appeals to me. But I could imagine someone growing up in a totally different house where all they talked about was like who was wearing what in shul, and what business ideas are really exciting, and who's pursuing opening up a new business and doing whatever. And the two examples who emerge from each of these homes could be equally good at being curious, or be equally skilled at being curious, at communicating well, at thinking critically. Is that true? Or
I don't know. In my experience interacting with the Jewish community, and I'm interacting in a very particular way because, I'm doing shidduchim right now, I don't think they go hand in hand because I can count the number of people on one hand that I've had interesting, deep, meaningful, and like intellectually engaged conversations where they show the curiosity, where they show the ability to think critically. I'm worried about this kind of trend towards anti-intellectualism. I think it's happening particularly within the modern Orthodox society, which is odd because that's what modern Orthodoxy
right,
was.
that's exactly what it should be.
Right. It's supposed to be this, you get the best of both worlds where you can engage with Torah in a very highly intellectual way, and you can engage in secular subjects as well and still be very cultured and, attend the opera and all of that. And back to your point about, well, is this the best way to do it? And I think there has to be something that's going to introduce people to the concept that there's more to the world than business, more to the world than science. So taking the Ramaz model, if we kind of force it on them, we stick them in an environment where this is mandatory and you are going to be forced to engage with these ideas in some way, it won't get everyone, but it'll get some people thinking. It will give some people the ability to read a book that's either a novel and think deeply about the themes, or read a nonfiction book about social psychology and recommend it.
How universal do you think that is? Like, and I struggle with this. Like, to what extent is, because I think in an ideal world, schools should not be structured such that only an elite group are fully successful in the environment of school. Right? Like that's a failure. Like that's the model we have right now. School is geared toward the top 20% of students. Those are the ones who are fully successful at school. And the remaining 70, 80% of students are some degree of not fully successful at school. And that's like, to me, that's just and that's why school is, I think, a chore and something that's unenjoyable for a lot of students, because I'm going into something that I just know I'm not going to be super good at, right, all the time. And you spend 12 years of your life cycling through that type of environment. That's just not, and then you're waiting to get out or to specialize and do, study whatever it is that you're actually interested in studying. So I really struggle with this idea that the goals we have in education should be something that 80-90% of students can be successful at and can feel success in and can feel that they've mastered. And I also value this idea that these core cognitive skills are really important, right? So let's stick with yours: curiosity, communication, critical thinking. Is there a way to set a standard within those skills that 80-90% of students can actually gain, master, and really benefit from? When they go from point A to point B in their learning, when they've traveled that distance, they can look back and say, yeah, I see what I gained there. And I see how I now deploy that in whatever it is I'm doing in my life because I gained those skills.
I don't know if it would be to master. You have this, this theory of learning to mastery, and, I've engaged with it, and I think it's brilliant. And I think it works really well for, the top 3% of the student population.
Well, that's a failure.
Well, as in, I remember looking at distribution curves,
right?
And the conclusion that you get after looking at an IQ distribution curve is that for about 50% of the population, there's probably value to going to university, because 50% of the population is at the higher age of things. There's about 3% who would really blossom and they'll become the intellectual elites, but there's a good, 45% that could be pushed. Maybe 20% that could be pushed either way. So you need to engage with them. What I would say in terms of how do we develop those skills, eliminate assessment. That's the problem. The problem is that we feel the need to assess learning. If we're trying to build curiosity, then the way the students show success on that front is not, okay, you scored 9 out of 10 on this piece of homework. It's, well, how deeply did you engage with this?
But why couldn't we? I agree with that completely, but why couldn't we assess that? Meaning, I never think of assessments as these final measures. I mean, it's part of learning mastery. These final measures of what you're worth, right? Assessments are just, it's like if you were in the gym and you had a target goal of I don't know, benching 150 pounds, right? You would have to try to know if you achieve that goal or not. You might work out other muscles to get there. You might be but at some point you're practicing that skill. And at some point, you're going to do it. I mean, if you were learning piano, at some point you would perform the piece that you're learning to show that you've mastered that skill. So I don't see assessments as the problem necessarily as much as what we're assessing, right? And this is something that I think teachers, and myself included, struggle with. Assessments are seen as the ugly stepchild of education. I got to give tests so I can give a mark. I hate grading the tests. Really, assessments should be the most important thing to us, because assessments are the thing as a teacher that you get to see how well you did your job, right? And if you're getting bad results, in other words, students are not mastering the assessment, there's one of two possibilities. Either you didn't do an effective job teaching it, you didn't do an effective job, or you didn't do an effective job designing the assessment. In other words, you did a really effective job teaching one thing, but what you're assessing is not actually that stuff. And I've seen both in my own teaching practice and in observing other teachers. So I get back to my point is there some base level, let's say, of critical thinking that you could measure that everyone can achieve? Because if there isn't, then what's the point, right? I mean, I get the idea of just practicing, but critical thinking and not measuring it, but then you won't know if you're successful or not. You have to measure it at some point.
I think the problem with critical thinking, focusing on that as a skill, is that there's so many prerequisites to critical thinking. And I just ran this assessment in my grade 9 class. I think I was telling you about it earlier, where we gave them an essay full of errors and we asked them to fact check it. And I remember one student went to one of the sources, and it was an Encyclopedia Britannica page. And she said, "Oh, do I have to read this all?"
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Right.
So the standards are so, yes, I do think we can probably enact some sort of standard of, okay, well, were you able to find all the errors, right? Were you able to correct them? Were you able to explain to me, what about it generated your interest or made you
Great.
think that this is, not correct.
Right.
But at the end of the day, and like I've got this freedom because I'm an art teacher, I'm so much more interested in the process than in the results. So I'm happy giving everyone completion marks. Like I'd give everyone a 100 as long as I could see them in class engaging with the product, engaging with the process, and searching out things. Like I don't care if you're not producing something good because I saw you, do 5 different kinds of sketches and talk to your peers and then do 3 sets of revisions. And then I saw you engage.
So I have 2 thoughts now. First of all, you could measure that as your skill, right? Like that you have put in time and showed improvement based on where your starting point was and where your ending point is. I don't think I love that, but that you could do, meaning you still wouldn't. And I'll tell you why I think it's important, because what you miss when you don't have some sort of evaluative moment is you miss the opportunity to allow the student to self-reflect, to see that they've made progress, and to understand, like, I had a criteria for progress, I had a goal for progress, and I met that goal. So I still think you have to have some point of metric where you are showing the student achievement. And if they're not doing that, if they're goofing off and not revising their work then they can see the contrast between them and someone who has.
So the problem with that is that assumes that all students are equally invested in learning, right?
Correct.
So
that is the core problem. I would say that is the problem I'm encountering in my entire project right now, is the students who are completely uninvested in
exactly. And
learning.
That's where I'm at right now with my current classes, of trying to identify the students who aren't engaged at all. Because I remember being a student and I was a really good student and I loved tests. I loved the challenge, because I was able to go see how well I had done. But then that would be educating for the top 5%.
So I disagree. And I'm coming at it from a totally different perspective. I was a terrible student who felt like I should be a better student, but had an undiagnosed learning disability, and by the time I was in high school, I was in the place many of my students, our students, are, which is I've already written myself off. Meaning I at that point I was not investing and I was not putting in work because I had spent years in education not seeing results from my work. So to me, the corrective thing is not to just say, well, that's for the top 3%. Let's forget about it for everyone else. The corrective thing is, how can we get everyone else to actually see results in their work? And I think number one, the thing you have to remove is the universal time constraints, right? So you can't apply the same time constraint to every single student. That's just because not everyone learns at the same rate. Not everyone learns at the same pace. The second thing you need to do is you need to define a standard that is actually achievable for the fat part of the bell curve, so that what you call mastery is achievable. And then the third thing you need to define is you need to create some measure of exceeding mastery that still pushes the students in that top, 3, 5, 10%, whatever it is, to be challenged. Right? So those are, to me, I see as sort of the 3 kind of steps you need to take. They're not simple, right? And so that's kind of where I'm getting at with this question is there a universally achievable, right, or largely universally achievable? I mean, obviously there is a curve, and there are people on both ends of the curve, and that tail can go out really far. So there's some people that are just not going to be able to meet, a standard. But can you get a standard in there? When it comes to these higher order thinking skills, can you get a standard in there that actually is achievable for everyone? Again, I agree, assuming that they're invested. But the solution is not to say, forget the standard if they're not invested. The solution is, well, why aren't you invested? Maybe it's because you've had years of engineering or years of messaging that is, that tells you you're just not going to be good at this, right? But if you had a different education from the beginning, and you've always been mastering what you're doing, just at a different pace than everyone else, you actually see results, and you're like, I can do these things. Is that achievable? I guess in your mind.
Well, here's like a question that I'll throw back at you. In terms of these higher order thinking skills, how do you assess them within yourself? And not in terms of like a professional sense, because I think you and I both are the kinds of people who we get a temperature of how we're doing as teachers quite constantly. But within your own personal life, do you sit down and say, okay, well, I found that I've only been reading things from the certain topic. I have only been listening to media from one
outlet.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
So yeah, I mean, I think, well, first of all, I think if I'm being honest, how I assess them in myself is through my teaching. Most of the learning I do as a teacher is what I'm going to teach, right? I mean, I have like tangential interests of other things, but for the most part, and I don't, this is not a negative. I love everything I teach. I teach philosophy, I teach economics, I teach history. These are all subjects I love. So engaging with them is just fun and easy. But I would say I do what you might call the Richard Feynman method, right? Like I want to learn something well enough to explain it. And so the way I assess it in myself is I write a lot. I try and really go through an idea after I've read it, watched it, listened to it, and either talk it out or write it out in a very clear way so that it makes sense to me. And that's just my method of like showing that I can think deeply about something. And then I'll develop questions about it, and I can kind of see everything spring off of that. So that's how I do it.
That's really interesting because I think that goes back to what you said earlier about how when you grow up within a very intellectual family, there's this constant need to prove yourself as smart, right?
Yeah.
Whereas within my family, everyone gets interested in things. And that's like the key thing where you sit around the Shabbat table and like my father for like several months was talking about consciousness. And like that was the only thing we were listening to was consciousness. And he was watching videos and telling us all about it. My sister got into like mountain climbing for some, like not doing it, but like talking about it and reading about it. And that's always been the way that I measured my own curiosity, my own ability at the time was, am I reading about a topic? Am I interested in a topic? So what I would love to give my students is that spark that leads them to go explore something new. Because I think that's like the most magical part. And that's the most enduring part. Like you're not going to remember biology from grade 11, but you will remember that joy of, oh, I'm really interested in this. Let me find out more.
So it's really interesting. I would say you're in, like going back to the essay that you just edited for me, you're in this very inspiration mode of education, where for you, like a successful educational experience is if you sort of, if any student has found a spark of inspiration toward these higher order thinking skills, creativity, something, right? Like it's sort of like in my mind, I see it as a minimalist kind of success model, right? So ditch all the grades, ditch all of that infrastructure that's elitist and privileging the top, highest percentage, and actually just make this about like kind of free association, figure out your, with kind of loose parameters where you're getting students to figure out what inspires them. Is that a fair description?
For the sake of my job, I will say that I very strongly feel standards, and like Jonathan has always joked about how I love to standardize things.
Right.
I like a playpen to work within. So I love standards, and I love having some sort of, structure that will confine it. But again, this is me as an art teacher. So the best thing that I can do is help the students move towards some sort of personal expression and personal interest. And their work is better when they're interested.
So if you had a class of 20 students and 18 graduated essentially having been inspired towards something of personal interest for them, then that is a successful learning experience for those students.
I think so.
So I just have a larger, like to me, it's like I have a more maximalist view. I think that isn't successful yet, but like, I just wonder, like, I'm going to be critical here and maybe out of place critical, but in your vision, I wonder if we reduce school to essentially, well, this is babysitting until you're an adult. And what can we do to kind of make this a somewhat enjoyable experience or meaningful experience for you? And I say that in a very dismissive way, and I don't mean it that way. Meaning I think that's great. Like if students walk out of an experience feeling inspired towards something, that's excellent. But it just seems like we can do so much more with the time we have. And I'll give you my example. Like no one expects that every human who engages in a Western education will not learn to read. That is a very core measurable skill. And the reason we expect that everyone's going to learn to read is obviously because everyone needs to know how to read, but also because we've totally eliminated the time boundaries on reading. We accept that it's appropriate from the age of 3 until really the age of 8 or 9 for anyone within that range to learn how to read. And so it's not so hard for everyone to master reading. Well, what if we just approached other skills that way? What if we just defined other skills and we said, we don't have to have this, you have to master this skill in November of your grade 9 year or your, October of your grade 12 year, because this is the skill, right? If you want to master it, like you have the range to do it in the time that it takes you. Why couldn't we get more students mastering more kind of core tangible skills than sort of these like more loose, informal inspiration?
Sure. I will caveat by saying my goal is specifically inspiration to love learning. I want them to be lifelong learners, right? So I don't care.
How do you do that without seeing success? Like, I just see it. See in practicality, it stays very surface. Like, oh yeah, I got inspired to find something that I wanted, but like, did I invest in it? Did I work at it? Did I produce something from it? What's the next step from that base level of inspiration? And once you're in that next step, you need to be measuring like what that is and how that student's progressing along that journey. Yeah, sure. Like to me, like I agree with that goal. Like I want my students to be lifelong learners, but you can't become a lifelong learner until you know what you want to learn and have an apparatus for approaching that learning challenge and know what success looks like.
Well, that's why I think university is so important, because in high school, we've given them this playground where they can explore different topics and hopefully get the background knowledge and the skills to develop that love of learning. And then when they get to university, that should be the stepping stone for them before they get out into the world. Not just, okay, well, how do I go to this so I can start making money? I didn't learn to think critically in high school. I learned to think critically in university. Again, this goes back to your...
Do you think that's a fault of high school?
Yeah, I do think. I wouldn't have been aware of the fact that I didn't know how to think critically were it not for one of my upper liberal courses. So that was not present in high school. And I think we're doing it a lot more now. But sure, like establish a set of standards, right? Pick out those skills. But then we, as an institution, need to be very, very on top of making sure those skills are being assessed or, introduced consistently throughout all 4 years of high school across all classes. And that's the problem with the entrepreneurial model of education, which is that it's going to happen in your class. It's going to happen in my class. We do a lot of reflecting in my class. Is it happening in the math classes? Is it happening in the biology classes?
Yeah, I agree with that. But I think the entrepreneurial model of education is what's necessary in a system that is already flawed, right? So let me just clarify what I see as the entrepreneurial model. So the entrepreneurial model is that you give teachers autonomy within their classroom to kind of create a set of standards and practices and to experiment with those standards and practices in order to find success, right? So then you might have different teachers kind of doing different things from a standards and practice perspective, but finding what they're passionate about and what they feel is working with their students. I don't think that's ideal if you're thinking about designing an educational model from K through 12. But I also don't think you can design an educational model from K through 12 for a province or a city, right? Or probably even a large, diverse Jewish community. Like you probably have to design a K through 12 model individually for students, based on their interests, and then have a system that supports their journey through that model with adjustments along the way based on what students want and parents want and so on. And then you would be able to merge both. You'd be able to have teachers kind of doing creative things, but in order to meet certain very specific goals that are identified for each student. I'll try to give a practical example of this, right? So like, let's take high school because that's our area, right? So you have a student who comes in and it's like, well, what do you want to do? Like, what's your end goal? Do you want to go to university? Do you want to become a doctor? right? Well, if you do, like, you're part of a larger system. That means you're going to need to take your sciences. That means you're going to need to get really good at taking, certain types of assessments. And so these are sort of the goals that we need to meet along this way. But another student comes in and says, I really don't want to be a doctor. In fact, I've had a miserable experience in school so far. I really like working with my hands and being creative. Okay, great. So let's put you on that path. And here are the metrics that you need to meet to be on that path, right? You can't have traditional classes in terms of like one teacher, 25 students in the same way it's structured. You have to work on manipulating that, which I think you can do. But that would be a way of allowing the students to sort of to be creative, allowing the teachers to be creative, but also sort of meeting standards. What you have now is you have this system that says everyone has to learn this and everyone has to learn that. Whether you want to be a doctor, you don't want to be a doctor, you have to learn science, right? Whether you want to, work with your hands or not, you have to take an art class, right? And so the teacher is forced to deal with a group of students through which many of them don't have particular interest, inclination. They all have their own stories about how they learn. And so in that model, instead of telling the teacher, here's a whole bunch of standards you need to meet, right? Because we're the school and we're imposing these standards, you actually let the teacher be flexible in that environment and figure out what's going to work for that diverse group of learners that they're forced to have between September and June and get to a certain place with. So it's not that I think that model's ideal. I think that's the best way to do it. And I'll give you my example of where it doesn't work. Like my kids' elementary school has these like policies that every kid has to have homework. So, I mean, there's a debate, certainly in primary school, whether homework's even worthwhile, whether it actually enhances learning or not. But school has a policy, everyone has to have homework. So every teacher gives a homework packet. What do? You're a conscientious parent. You sit with your kid and you go through the homework, and then the kid hands it in. The teacher throws it in a pile and never gives them any feedback on it. Maybe some teachers are doing that and some teachers aren't because they didn't buy into the policy that you gave them and the standard that you gave. So they're meeting the standard, technically. They're giving homework, right? They might review it, put a check mark on it, but they're not actually invested in that. They don't think that's the best model for what they're doing in their classroom. So what's the point of having the standard? Similar thing in my kids' elementary school. The school has a policy, X number of days before a test, a review packet has to go out. But the teacher doesn't tell you then whether they've actually reviewed that material in class yet or not. And so this is where I sort of came to that entrepreneurial policy where it's like, at the end of the day, I've seen so many schools that, create these policies, which are basically in response to parents complaining about something, right? And the teachers then fulfill the technical letter of the law in this policy, but they don't actually believe this is good for what their students need to learn. And if you want to take it one step further, it actually undermines teacher creativity because what a teacher ends up doing then is like being like, oh, I'm now just the, implementer of various policies as opposed to a person who's charged with actually thinking creatively and figuring out what's going to work for this particular group of students that I have this year. And you know as well as I do, you can have vastly different dynamics and groups of students in any given year. And your whole standards could be thrown off based on the group of students you're getting and what package they're coming in with.
I just want to ask you, what do you think's the original sin of education then? Like, you dislike the model of school that we have. And I think when I my first couple of years of teaching, I was like very on board with that of like skills over knowledge. Let's focus on doing and experiential learning rather than, sit and memorize. And now I've kind of come around to this idea that there is this core level of base knowledge. And I think that's
funny because that's what I was pushing you on before. Right. I think there's a core base skill. It's like, I'm not against memorizing. I think memorizing is really important, right? If you want to define that as an important skill, right? So there are certain
But here's the thing. Yeah. No, so I don't think it's the skill. The problem is knowledge. There is a certain level of knowledge that you need in order to interact meaningfully to live meaningfully within the Jewish community. Mm-hmm. You need to have a standard knowledge of kashrut, the laws of kashrut, of Tanakh. You need to know the story. You need to know practical halacha. There is just this body of knowledge that you need. And we acknowledge that because unless the Jewish classes have changed significantly since when I went, they were all knowledge courses, mm-hmm. right? And they didn't give me the skills to learn further on my own, which is why I don't really engage in Jewish learning of my own. I never found it interesting. I never found it engaging. But I can live a Jewish life. I can keep it kosher.
I agree with that completely. But I would ask you, what percentage of the total learning is that? Like, I'll tell you my answer, 25%, right? And that's just how I structured it in my class. Meaning, so I teach history of the modern Middle East. My goal is 25% of the learning is Shabbat table conversant in the history of the modern Middle East, meaning there are just basic things you should know to be an intelligent conversationalist about this, right? So you should know, if you want to talk about Muslims, what the Sunni Shia divide is, how that happened, what kind of the basic story is behind that, right? And which countries sort of fall into which categories and how that manifests itself. That doesn't mean you need to remember a ton of dates. You need to remember details of battles or anything like that, right? So I agree with you. There is a certain amount of knowledge that is important to be conversant. And the same, it would be, you could, map the same onto kashrut and so on. But 75% of being a lifelong learner is the skills, right? Like I can know the basics of kashrut, 2 sets of dishes. I can't transfer the tam between 2 things unless there's, hot and liquid and these sorts of things. So I can know, like, roughly when do I need to call the rabbi to ask a question or look on the internet to figure out what I need to do. I can have sort of that basic framework. But at the end of the day, anything beyond that, I'm actually going to need the skills to, first of all, think about the question I want to ask, understand how to look it up, how to learn about it, how to ask intelligent questions. Like, I aspire to more for myself and for my children and for my students, than just like kind of having that basics. Like, I don't want my students just to be Shabbat table conversant in the history of the modern Middle East. I want them to be able to analyze sources and ask questions about sources and think about how Chada'am's version of Zionism was different from Herzl's version of Zionism, which was different than Jabotinsky's version of Zionism. Like, I want them to develop. Those are the skills I think that are important. Now, I come back to bring us full circle. I come back to the question, like, can I create a standard for those skills that 90% of my students can meet, right? And still challenge, the top 10, 20%. I don't have an answer to that question yet. That's kind of what I'm working on. But that's like, I think that's important.
How's that going?
Good. Like, good in the sense that I'm working on it. I would say the 2 greatest challenges I've encountered so far are, how do I set the standard and how do I assess for that standard? And I don't have any great answers there. I'm like experimenting with different things. The second great challenge I have is, how do I deal with the students who have already checked out? Right. So everything I'm doing is premised on the idea that you're invested in investing, right? Like, you want to try and you want to retake and redo and work toward mastering that skill. Even if I've perfectly defined the standard and I've managed to, perfectly nail what I'm trying to measure, what do I do with the students? Just like, yeah, you'll give me a 60? Cool. Like, I'm good. Like, you give me a 70? Like, that's fine. I really don't aspire to more. Or there's another version of that student who's not, I'm okay with the 70, the student who's just grade obsessed. Like, just get me the way to get a 90. I don't care. Like, I'm not invested in what you're doing here. I'm just invested in figuring out the best angle to, like, manipulate the system to get me to a 90, who's also in opposition to me in a different sort of way.
I wonder if there's a way of, even within the standards, of setting different standards for assessment. So within my grade 11 Comtech class, I brought it into the boys this year. I've never taught it at the boys. And I knew that I was going to a chat GPT obsessed course. And to some degree, I kind of thought, well, yeah, I guess this is the future, right? One of our colleagues does video editing on the side, and she was showing me what she was doing with these AI technologies. And I went, well, what's the point of me showing them how to edit videos in Premiere Pro if they can just get AI to do this? So I established 3 different models of assessment for my students. And I said, okay, if you are going, there's always a process, product, and presentation.
Mm-hmm.
Makes everyone do a presentation at the end of the project. And then if you use AI, the assignment is weighted at 80% on your presentation. If you did everything on your own, the assessment is weighted 10% on your presentation. And
how do you tell? Just technical question.
I walk around, so I see them engaging and I see them in the work. And for the most part, 90% of my students are not using AI.
Yeah. So I had the I shared that project with you. I did a similar thing where I asked students to either opt into using AI or not, and no one opted into using AI. Right? When it was like clear. Now, I also encourage students to use AI, and I believe it's my responsibility as a teacher to assess around that. Right? Like, so, AI to me is like a potentially good tool. I'm not sure how good a tool it is yet, but it's a potentially good tool to generate ideas, to help you review your work, to edit, whatever it might be. But at the end of the day, I have to be able to create an assessment apparatus that forces you to meet the criteria without AI doing it for you. Right. And that I think is doable. I am not one of these people who thinks this is like the end of education as we know it. I think it's doable. I just think it's a matter of rethinking how we're doing things and what our priorities are. I want to shift topics, if that's okay. Because one of the things that came out of the article, which was actually my immediate reaction, I would have thought we'd get to this sooner, is this idea that what really drives change in education are these kind of financial incentives or this economic system that exists on top of what's happening in schools. And this is something that resonates with me a lot as a former principal, is that there's often like two layers of conversation. There's and I'm saying in the best case scenario, there's your teacher conversation, which is about courses and learning and curriculum and so on. And then there's your administrator level conversation. And I don't mean like there's obviously, administrators who are invested in the learning and so on, but the administrator level conversation is recruitment and market and, what do we need to serve the people who are hiring us and paying for us, essentially. And I definitely believe in my, 20 years in education that I have seen the tail end of the teachers, the learning people owning the education system, where the conversation was really driven by people thinking about what we should learn and how we should learn it and what is best, and based on whatever standards they had, may have been good, may have been bad, but that was the conversation, to what is our audience, what does our customer want, and how can we give them what they want, right? And, he had this sort of cynical take that that's just kind of really what's always driven things to a certain extent. And I don't know, I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
I mean, a large part of it, as I see it, comes down to what the society values at the time.
Right.
Right? Like, I think one of the most interesting periods of time to look at is the High Renaissance in Italy, because so much of the arts is generated by rich people not wanting to look stupid. And the way that they don't look stupid is that they contribute to public affairs. So therefore they commission art, right? So Michelangelo, like all of these great artists that, are now the turtles, they come from this value that was created externally by society,
right?
Or internally.
It's like the old like thought experiment. Like, what does LeBron James do if we don't have the NBA? Well, maybe he plays football, right? What does he do if you don't have the NFL, right? Like, if we don't have a professional media-driven sports empire, like maybe he's a long jumper, right? Like, there's just like these like scenarios you can play out where a person is only where they are because that's what the society is valuing.
Exactly. And I think what universities were at in their inception were places that valued learning. You went to university because you wanted to explore a topic, right? And the only thing people did in university was learn. And now the end goal of university is a career.
Right.
And then the administrators come in and they say, well, how do we turn our institution of learning into an institution for careers?
So how does that cycle down to the high school level?
Well, you mentioned this at the beginning, that we see this within our private institutions so much that the students feel they're paying, or the parents feel that they are paying a large amount of money, therefore their students should get certain results. It's insert a coin, come out with, a 95 average.
Right.
I'm not sure how it's factored.
So what's at the core of the problem there? Because that's not an unreasonable claim, right? Like, that's not an unreasonable thing. Like, I'm paying for something I want, like, what I'm paying for. Like, why do I want to pay for my child to get a 75? Like, that's not an unreasonable issue.
No, and from a monetary perspective, yes. Like, from a financial perspective, yes, that makes sense, right?
So
right.
Where's the problem?
The problem is, and this is like a very personal thing, is do you value education? Like, is education of value to you and to your family? Is learning of value to you and your family?
So let's say I answer that question, yes, and I still didn't pay for my child to get a 75. Meaning, I would say I fall into that category, right? Like, if I think about my own kids, like, and it happens to be I don't care about their marks because I understand how broken the system is. So I care much more that they're learning, which unfortunately they're not to a large extent. But yeah, I could have the same thing. I could say, I do value education. I do value learning, right? I don't want you to just give my kid a 95. I understand there's a parent out there who's just like, give my kid a 95 because it's all about the result to get them to the career. But the question still holds, even if I value learning. Still, if my kid's in the 80%, right, they're not going to be really successful at it. So you're not serving them in that goal.
But then what the parents need to do is go to the teacher and say, well, how are you going to help my kid improve? Show me where they're doing wrong. And that's where the assessment is necessary, right? You look through, say, okay, well, you're struggling with the creativity. And then the parent has to come in and say, well, okay, what are you going to do to fix this? And what can I do to support you as you fix this?
Yeah, well, you know what the answer is when you ask that question.
Right.
What do you think the answer is? Now that since you don't have kids, I'll let you opine on that. What do you think the answer is when you go to the teacher and you say, "Well, how are you helping my child improve?"
So here's the thing: like, I've never been in a circle where that was a thing. If we did badly in school, it was our own fault. My mother and father always took the side of the teacher.
Same deal, right? But let's say you would go to a teacher, because I have, right? Not in that sort of threatening a way, but like just try to ask basic questions of scaffolding, like, how are you helping my child get there? I'll tell you, typically the response is, it's not my job. I mean, I've done my job. I've taught this unit. This is when the test is. Like, it's beyond the scope of what I'm meant to do to help your child beyond that point. And that's, I think at the core of parent frustrations, more than just give my kid the 95 so they can get the good grade in the job. And I'll explain why. Because I think once you're not going to help them learn, because at the end of the day, your system is so broken that 80% of students are not going to be fully successful at their learning, then yeah, just give them the 95 because I'm paying $30,000 a year for this. But if you could actually show me that you're invested in my child so that they actually can improve in such a way that the child and the parent are like, wow, yeah, that worked. Like, I got that concept. That would change. Like, I don't think it's just that something has shifted in the ether where all of a sudden parents are like no longer valuing education. And I'm not discounting that, because that probably is true too, but I don't think it's as big as we think. I think it's that a lot of parents, as education and everything has become more expensive, are saying this system is bad and it's not serving me anyway. So once it's not serving me, like, I'm paying a lot of money, get me at least the result, because I see the whole system's corrupted. But I know if my child gets the 95, they're going to get into the university program they want. And that's going to open doors for them that are not open for them. And they'll figure it out like everyone else is going to figure it out. So at least give them that.
That question of, well, how do you help the student improve, right, and get better at things is something that's on my mind constantly, right? Of, okay, well, how do we structure learning to give them that ramp?
Right.
The problem that I've been seeing, and this is anecdotal completely, is that I don't think the parents that are coming in are concerned about education.
Right. I want to talk about, let's say this Tikva school, right? So they're invested in providing a classical, Western education on the premise that there is actually something unique about this content, and uniquely valuable about this content. And, I think they're not skill focused, right? Like, they are skill focused. But they think this is basically the best medium to sort of develop these critical thinking, communication, curiosity skills that you identify. What do you think about that?
I think 2 years ago, I would have been more skeptical. Now I'm kind of coming around to this idea that there's an education that worked for 500, 600 years since like Shakespeare's time, right? That's the time that grammar schools start coming around, and it produced Shakespeare. I would be curious to see is if it could withstand the technological environment that we're in. Because to my mind, I think education got messed up by technology, by integrating technology too broadly, and I have a suspicion that phones and social media are actively rewiring our brains in a way that no one anticipated they would, and that we'll see the results of this. Like, we're starting to see it now with the kids, but I think we'll see it more like 20 years down the line.
Right. So like I just did this in my class. We just analyzed, we're in the middle of analyzing, I mentioned it earlier, these like three articles, like one by Herzl, one by Mahara and one by Jabotinsky. And I can see the struggle the students have in reading. And I'm reading it in class. And even, I do call on them to read here and there, but I read a lot and I'm very animated and engaging. And there is a percentage of students that can still analyze text, but there's a large number of students who struggle with it. And the question and that's fine, right? Like I'm okay with that. I want them to struggle with it. But the question I come away with is, to what extent am I fighting a losing battle here in the larger and broader world of education? I think I used to be able to say, this is a really important skill you're going to need in whatever you do, is the ability to read something and extract the key ideas from that. And that is how I would define the most base criteria of analysis of a piece of text, is like you can read it and you can extract the main ideas from that text and, let's say, express them in your own words, right? That's a higher order thinking skill at its most basic level. And, obviously you can have difficult texts and less difficult texts, which then move it, but let's, that's a separate measure there. To what extent is that still a valuable skill? I know it is from the way I think the human brain should work, but is that a valuable skill in the way human brains are going to work in 30 years and 40 years?
Yes. And I think the reason I think that is because I think the people who are going to make it to the top are going to be the ones with the old-fashioned skills. Take the new kind of reading. Like, there was this podcast series that came out during the pandemic, or like towards the end of the pandemic, called Sold to Story, about how for the past 20 years, apparently America has been using a really bad curriculum to teach students how to read.
Right. This is like the return to phonics again.
Yes,
like we came full circle. Yeah.
And like at the end of the day, it is probably going to be like a mix of the two.
Right.
But like my mother said, when I told her about the story, she said, "Oh yeah, when we went to Eitz Chaim, they told us we're using the most old-fashioned teaching methods possible."
Right. That's a very, yeshivish,
Which is,
we've done it this way for 50 years. There's no way. By the way, it's also a Toronto mindset. Like Chad has the same problem. Like, oh, we've done it 50. It's great. Why should we ever change?
But at the same time, I think that there was something in the water with, like, take my generation,
right,
my grade, where we were raised on paper and pencils and binders.
Mm-hmm.
And we were able to get into technological environments and make it work and figure things out. And we had like the elasticity in our brains to say, okay, well, I need this to do this, so therefore we're going to look this up, or I'm going to go and do this. Our students now don't do that. When they want an answer to something, they ask me. They don't think, oh, well, maybe I'll Google this, right? Maybe I'll search around my files. Half of my job is showing students what local storage is, where like they save a file on the computer. That's something that like we grew up learning.
Right. Google was amazing because you had an orientation toward research, and this was a tool that made research easier. But now nobody's interested in Google. Now finish that sentence for me. Why? What's changed?
I would say a lack of curiosity.
And what causes that? Too much media. Just
I
too
would think
much.
so, yeah.
I'm not curious because I've never had time to stop and sit and be curious because I've just been engaged constantly with media.
Mm-hmm. We live like in an age of information where information is available all the time. And I think people at the start of it thought, oh, this is going to be great. We're going to this is the future.
Right.
And that didn't happen because people just kind of started getting fed things. So now they're only going to engage with something that is being fed to them rather than search out what they want to see. Like, I don't know.
Well, that's all the more reason, let's say Tikva style school, is to push students to courses of study that are core and structure, because it's been determined that these are the most important courses of study. And so you can't just deal with what you're being fed. You actually have to push yourself out of that comfort zone. On that happy note. Goodbye, everybody.